speaker is Peter Gething, who's going to be talking Interpreting Data for Action, the application of geostatistical models of malaria metrics, and I'm really looking forward to understanding what that means.
We negotiated it.
Thank you, Gina. Good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, thank you to both of you for the invitation to come and take part in this symposium celebrating Alan's legacy. It really is an honour to be here, so thanks again. So I'm actually going to pick up on some of the themes that have been mentioned by most of the speakers already in this symposium. I'm going to talk about some of the work that we're doing at the Malaria Atlas project back in Oxford. In particular, the development and application of a whole suite of different geospatial and geostatistical models, really to try and maximise the utility of information that we can draw from what are often imperfect data that arise from malaria surveillance in all of its different guises. So I'll probably surprise no one in the room by starting my talk with some maps. These are actually hot off the press. These are our brand new updated global maps of P. falciparum parasite rate on the top and P. vivax parasite rate on the bottom, and the corresponding estimates of changing burden through time for both. It's actually back in 2011 that the Malaria Atlas project last generated global maps for the two parasites. So we've done some interim updates for Africa in the meantime, but at the global scale, it's actually been quite a hiatus. So it's good to have these out. These are now going to be updated annually on an annual cycle. We're doing them in collaboration these days with IHME, and this body of work forms the malaria component of the Global Burden of Disease study. So that work is obviously pitched at the global scale. What are the maps for? Well, at the high level, they're for comparing at the kind of national scale patterns of risk geographically, so sort of spatial comparison, and also for comparing differential rates of progress between countries in their progress towards reducing burden and elimination. So they're for those kind of broad brush comparisons, and for that reason, when we're thinking about the data that needs to go into them and the methodological frameworks that we build to use those data, there's a very strong emphasis on comparability. So what does that mean? It means we will always favour data that are somewhat standardised. So if you're measuring something in one country, it means the same thing as that same type of data measured in a different country. And ideally, we're going to be using data that are obviously widely available, data that we can get from most endemic countries in order to make those comparisons. So within Africa, that's tended to mean that we base all of our modelling on parasite rate, and Noor spoke a lot about parasite rate in his talk. Outside Africa, it tends to be API, annual parasite incidence, which is one of the worst misnomers in malariology, but essentially API is just aggregated case reports, aggregated routine case reporting data, so the number of cases occurring in a district or in a province or in a region over a year, and that's as reported by ministries of health. So that's our core input data set or type of data outside Africa. And both of these have limitations. Parasite rate, and Noor went into more detail so I can be quite brief here. We have this issue of latency. So parasite rate, it takes a long time from when a child is bled and RDT is carried out. So that data actually going through the sort of the process and becoming available for us as modellers to use, 1 year, 2 years. So this is not a timely type of data. It's not very good for real-time monitoring. PR is also neither directly representative of the intensity of transmission or of clinical burden. It's kind of an intermediate metric that's convenient to measure, but really doesn't necessarily tally with the thing that programs might be really interested in keeping track of. There's also this issue that because it stems often from cross-sectional household surveys, there might not necessarily be the same buy-in to that data as a kind of authentic yardstick of what's happening in a given country, as opposed to data that the Ministry of Health are generating themselves through passive case detection at their health clinics. And it's also a bad metric when you get down to low transmission, simply because if you've got one infected person in 1,000, you're going to have to take a lot of samples in order to understand your pattern of infection across the country, so it becomes prohibitively expensive. And then on the API side, there's some very different but equally serious limitations that we need to be aware of, and these primarily relate to the fact that this is aggregated data. Okay, so we're immediately losing a lot of the potential of the raw data at the point at which it's collected at clinics by the fact it's just available in this aggregate form. So Noor mentioned a lot of the obvious biases in passive case detection. One of the most important is missingness. So in any given district, a certain proportion of facilities in a given month just won't file a report, or the report's lost. So there's lots of holes. If you zoom down to the facility month level, there's lots of gaps in the data. They're completely invisible when you get the aggregate data. You don't know how much missingness there was. You don't know where the missingness happened. You just have this bias that you can't really contend with using the aggregate data alone. API are also poorly suited to low transmission settings, where you might be interested in very specific focal points of high transmission within an administrative unit. And again, it's aggregated, so you don't see that. It's washed out in the aggregate. So for all these reasons, the data that we rely on for this global scale work, which has key advantages in that context, is really not necessarily optimal if what you're trying to do is support operational planning and implementation at the level of countries, the kind of information that programs might need on a regular basis to inform their decision making. And similarly, it's not very well suited in particular to low transmission settings. So, while the global work, the global maps, the global burden estimation within MAP obviously will continue apace, we are also trying to develop in parallel a program of research which is focusing very much at the country level and trying to drill down and address some of these issues so we can provide more useful support operationally to countries and to programs. And we're starting this in the 16 countries that you see here. This is working very closely with the Clinton Health Access Initiative, and through them working more closely with national programs themselves. This is all funded by the Gates Foundation. So in those countries, we're trying to do two main things. Firstly, we're trying to get essentially better malaria metric data. Key amongst this is getting more granular surveillance data. So can we get reports of cases at the level of individual health facilities and months, rather than aggregated up and at the annual level? And in some cases, can we get reports of individual cases and where those households are located? We'll also try and get any other metrics that may be available or may be useful. So serology is something we're putting a lot of time and effort into building up the analytical frameworks around to feed into this kind of work. A whole range of different entomological metrics, for example. And we're trying to improve our covariates, the geospatial data from satellite imagery and other sources that go in and help us inform the patterns of risk of malaria. It's a rapidly emerging, hugely expanding field. There's new stuff coming out all the time. We try and stay on top of that and constantly improve our covariate library. So that's on the data side. And then to kind of complement that, we need to develop a much more diverse, a much more kind of flexible and responsive toolbox of analytical tools that can exploit all these different types of new and emerging data and use them in the best way we can. So examples of that would include improving the way that we can handle this aggregated surveillance data. Can we get more information out of that? Models that can appropriately interpret and model the facility-based case counts. Models around the serology and how we can potentially infer things like force of infection and how that varies spatially and temporally based on seroconversion observations in individuals. And then importantly, can we sort of join all this up in integrated modelling frameworks so that whatever types of data happen to be available in a given country, we can use them together in an integrated framework and draw strength across the different metrics, which may have complementary strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of a flavour of how some of these tools look like and what they do. Where we have a situation where we've been able to get aggregate case data only, so that's the image on the left, that's aggregated case incidents. As I said, we may be interested in trying to pinpoint focal areas of transmission within those larger blocks. So how is this possible from the aggregate data? Well, what we can do is take our very detailed geospatial covariates. This is very high resolution imagery and information about the environment, temperature, vegetation, etc., and we can leverage the fact that there's relationships between those covariates and our incidence data at the aggregate level, and we can infer what that means for the sub-unit variation. So in other words, we can infer this pixel level, much more high resolution pattern that is consistent with the one on the left, but leverages the relationship with these high resolution covariates. So if we go one step down, and now we're dealing with data on case reports at the level of individual facilities. So schematically that would look something like that. Each of those green dots is a health facility. And of course what we get are counts of cases, just X number of cases in a given facility in a given month. Now as you can imagine, if you actually want to go ahead and model that, we need to standardize those counts. We need rates, right? So we need to infer a denominator population from which that case count arose. We don't have that data. We just need to do something to try and infer sensible denominators. So the first thing we need to ask is, well, what fraction of people would have sought care from any facility? What's the pattern of treatment seeking within a given region? And we have a whole raft now of geospatial models to try and estimate and generate maps of treatment seeking rates based on data from household surveys, based on covariates, based on understanding of the transport networks that people would use, etc. And then once we have an idea of the fraction that would seek care at all, the next question is, well, which of those particular facilities do we think any particular person might have gone to? So we start carving up the population into catchment populations. And again, there's been a surprisingly sophisticated amount of modelling that we've had to do to get that right, and I'll give you a demonstration of that in just a second. So we can put all these components together, we can estimate our catchment denominators, we can standardise our counts and turn them into rates, and then we can put those rates into our geostatistical spatial modelling frameworks and generate continuous surfaces of estimated risk, like the one on the bottom right. And then the most detailed type of data we could get is obviously individual case records. So the black dots here are actual cases and the households of residents of those cases. And this is a completely different type of data, and it requires a completely different type of model. We can't use our standard geostatistical frameworks, which is built around rates. Suddenly we've just got points on a map. They're not a count, it's just a location. So in geostatistical parlance, we call that a point pattern, and we use a type of a fairly new type of geostatistical modelling called log-Gaussian-Cox process modelling to infer the underlying pattern of risk. What this graphic just shows is the added benefit of that type of data where they're available. So on the left, we artificially aggregated that data up to facilities, pretended we didn't have it, and did some modelling, and we end up with a map like the one on the left. If you do have that extra granularity, you can drill out much more detail like we've done on the right. Okay, so finally I'm just going to exemplify this in practice, some of these tools, using the example of Haiti. So Haiti, of those 16 countries that I popped up, is probably one of the ones we've been working in most intensely. And also a lot of the most interesting kind of work in terms of the diversity of data that's available and so on. So this again is working very closely with CHAI to provide support to the national programme and the Malaria Zero Alliance, and thanks to both of those organisations for the consent to present this work. And we're doing things in Haiti at two levels. Firstly, at the national level. So nationally, we've got now data from individual health facilities on case counts. We're applying these catchment models. We're doing this process of generating standardised rates. We're doing our geostatistical mapping. And I just want to use this to demonstrate why a certain degree of sophistication turns out to be really important, and that you have to be very careful with this type of data, and you can get very, very wrong maps if you just make, if your approach doesn't have the necessary nuance, and this is something we've kind of learned by trial and error as we've gone through. So this idea of catchments seems intuitively like it shouldn't be that difficult, right? An obvious assumption would be, well, people probably just go to their nearest health facility, give or take. So you can just draw lines around the facilities and cookie cut the population. Everyone's keep doing that. Sorry, everyone's just going to go to their nearest health facility. So this is where we started. And if you apply that type of approach, you can get an estimated population denominator. You can use that along with your count from each health facility, that's the dots, and you can get a standardised rate. So the colours on that map now show you the standardised rate applied using this crude catchment modelling approach. Now immediately, as a spatial modeller, you look at that map and you think we're going to struggle here, because there's no kind of organisation to that pattern. There's no spatial structure jumping out at you. You've got red and blue, which are the high incidence and low incidence facilities, juxtaposed and kind of speckled all over the place. And indeed, when you then take that standardised data and you try and use it in a geostatistical model, you come up with this very kind of patchy-looking map, which immediately doesn't tally with our kind of a priori expectations of what the epidemiology of malaria looks like on Haiti. So, it's kind of back to the drawing board. How can we do something a little bit more sensible with these data? And we've developed much more elaborate ways of understanding where people go to seek care based on a whole range of different factors. You relax the assumption that they go to their nearest, because it turns out they very often don't. You acknowledge that different health facilities have different kind of draw capacity, have different attractiveness based on the size, based on the quality of care they provide, maybe based on the cost of getting care from a different facility, the transport network, etc., etc. And you try and take these things into account, and you try and then optimise your use of that type of model to work out what catchment populations actually are. And when you do something like that, and apply the standardized rates, you get a map that looks completely different. And I don't know how well you can see those little dots, but suddenly you're far more optimistic because there's whole areas where all the facilities are blue, the standardized rates are low, whole areas where they're red, and whole areas where they're in the middle. In other words, there's spatial structure and organization now where previously there wasn't. And when you go ahead and map, you get a completely different idea of what the spatial pattern of risk looks like in Haiti just by that change to the catchment modeling component. And suddenly that does make a lot more sense. The areas we know are the real problem areas on the island, down in the extreme southwest at the end of that long peninsula, it's called Grand Anse, and that kind of wedge shape, which is the Artibonite Valley. Suddenly they're jumping out in the way that gives us a lot more reassurance. Because we're using facility data now that's by month, it's a reasonably modest extension to our models to develop monthly evaluations of risk. So we're really drilling down into the seasonality and the variation of incidents throughout the year. And this potentially, depending on the intervention you're trying to plan for, is crucially important information in terms of timing of deployment of different interventions. So that's the national level work. Now, people who know what's going on in Haiti know that Grand Anse, as I mentioned down in the southwest, is one of the most sort of high burden areas. It's also a place where some of the most intense activity, control program activity, is being planned. So we were asked if we could kind of zoom in one extra level to that smallish region of Haiti, and can we go to even more detail to support some very specific targeting activities there, and to exploit some specific data sets that were going to be available there. So I'll just very quickly run through that. So one thing we wanted to do was to improve this underlying map of population distribution, because that's one of the critical ingredients in getting this catchment population stuff right, and also in working out where your burden then lies in terms of the clusters of the population. So the top map was the one we were dealing with. That's the open source WorldPlot project. It's generally pretty good, and it's a huge advancement on what went before it, and that would have been our default. But we were able to augment that because we had this data via the Gates Foundation from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, who had actually used satellite imagery to identify individual structures throughout the whole of Grand Anse. And then that was supplemented by a very detailed household enumeration carried out by the program and Malaria Zero. And we fused those two different data types together in a model to redistribute the population. And you can see it's really different. When you get that very, very granular data on the ground, you get a very different picture of where people live. That's a very fundamental operational piece of information for the program to then plan what they want to do. We also were lucky in this particular place that we had some really good entomological data. So there'd been surveys of potential breeding sites and records of where we saw larvae and where we didn't. And we can take that, and again, there's a whole load of geospatial modelling that was required to get this right. But this is a map of the probability of finding Anopheles larva in any given 100 metre pixel in Grand Anse. There was a whole load of survey work from easy access groups on serology, seropositivity in children. Again, a whole load of modelling work that was done in MAP over many months to develop this map, which is estimated seropositivity based on that easy access group survey. So we've now got all these additional ingredients that we can put in. So we go back to our facility level case reports that are available nationally, but in this particular place we can add to that the population map, the larval map, the serology information, and we can put them all together in an integrated framework and now re-estimate incidents. And you can see just how granular we're able to get with all of those data inputs. So you've now got very, very specific and well delineated areas of elevated risk in Grand Anse. And this is then, fed back up by CHAI and the program, and is supporting targeting schemes for very specific interventions, MDA and community health worker targeting. So in summary, the globally available data that we base our global maps on are not always optimal for programmatic support. Nationally available data, when coupled with geospatial models, can support precise planning, decision-making, precise action, even in low transmission settings. And of the sort of new and emerging data sets available, I think by far the most important going forward will be this facility-level case reporting. And increasingly it is available. Surveillance systems are strengthening. The digital platforms that facilitate that data, the assimilation of it and the dissemination of it, things like DHIS2, are, the uptake of that is rapidly growing. This graph, the blue and green are countries that are actually implementing DHIS2 or piloting it, and that map adds new countries all the time. So I think we can confidently predict that the coming years will probably see a pretty rapid increase in the quality, the availability, and the granularity of routine surveillance data. And I think it's beholden on us and anyone else in the sort of analytical community to just be in a position so that we have the tools to maximally exploit these emerging data sets as they start to come into existence. So I didn't include my acknowledgement slide, which I'm very embarrassed about, but thank you very much to my group. Thank you to our partners and our collaborators, and thank you to the Gates Foundation.
I'll invite the panel members to come up. Dr. Noor. So the floor is open for questions. If anyone dares to get up to the microphone. A bit of readjustment there. Oh, wonderful.
Gosh.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Ursula Dalrymple, currently unemployed.
We're having problems because so many people are moving in the back. If you could speak up.
Hi, I'm Ursula Dalrymple, currently unemployed. My question is primarily, I guess, for Dr. Noor. So you mentioned that there are several different ways of putting together national malaria case counts, one of which is adjusting routine health facility data, and the other is using these prevalence to incidence models, which both kind of fundamentally estimate different metrics. So the case count estimates malaria positive fevers, and the prevalence to incidence estimates truly symptomatic cases. What do you think is the most important number to estimate here? And is it important that, that the difference between these case counts is kind of sometimes unacknowledged? Does that actually matter?
Who would like to tackle that
one? Thank you. I'll first of all start by saying that it matters. The difference matters. Which of the two numbers is important? I think to an epidemiologist who is interested mainly in research and transmission, perhaps malaria attributable fevers might be the thing that matters. But for the health system and health workers who have to deal with individuals who they suspect through a reasonably imperfect algorithm whether they have malaria or not on the basis of a number of symptoms, and then test and treat those individuals. I think that's what matters to them. That's what is funded in the health system. That's what they know as their burden of disease. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And that's what's important to the WHO as well. In terms of contextualizing that with respect to, despite this number of cases, is transmission declining, is the age pattern shifting? Those are other things that need to be done, I think, in terms of operational research and other supportive evidence.
Yes.
I'm Oneling. I'm a Tulane University student, and I'm originally from Ethiopia, and I've been working in surveillance. So my question is, as expected, on surveillance. So I have a little bit of difficulty in understanding transforming surveillance as intervention. So what's intervention? But my question is actually, when we say if we are in a situation in a resource-limited country, what is the guidance in prioritization? Like, should we strengthen the surveillance system or actually prioritize, again, the actual interventions, which is LA line or RRS or things like that? So what is the guidance? And my final question is, what's strong surveillance? I mean, surveillance, it can go from like asking people, do you have fever, all the way up to the presentation about using genetics. So where is strong surveillance? What's strong surveillance? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. 3 questions. What is surveillance as intervention? I think the way to think about it, the way at least I think about it, is to think about the response that you need to mount. And if your surveillance is good enough to mount an effective response, then so your surveillance is part of the intervention package. And so that's the way, it's a surveillance that's fit for purpose, and that purpose varies depending on where you are in the transmission continuum. In terms of prioritization, whether to prioritize surveillance or to prioritize interventions, the question really is, how do you effectively prioritize your other interventions if you do not have good surveillance data? And it's a question of avoiding those inefficiencies, which in the short term might make you think that investment in surveillance is very expensive. But in the long term, the losses you make through inefficiencies mean that actually you're neither achieving the impact you want nor improving and making long-term savings by investing in your surveillance. So that's how you should look at it. What does strong surveillance mean? Again, brings me back to the kind of decisions you have to make. What's the response? What do you want to do? And once you have defined that, does your surveillance system support that? And I think that's how you define what a strong surveillance in your context means. And the generic types of surveillance that the WHO kind of puts out, as you know, differs by the transmission continuum. There's one that's fit for elimination, but there are others that you don't do in countries like Nigeria or DRC. You don't recommend case investigations because you're dealing with a large set of cases. There are other priorities in the surveillance system. And by and large, your passive case detection system is enough to support the decisions you want to make with other things like entomology and occasional household surveys, etc.
Diane, do you want to add anything?
And I would say, I think Noor did a very good job of answering it. And I think the idea, is to have a menu of options available that you can adjust as your situation changes. So the goal, of course, is that transmission and burden will go down in every country, but that's going to happen in a different time scale. And so having these tools available now means that you can anticipate what kind of surveillance you might need a year from now, 5 years from now. And to comment on the genetic surveillance, I think, again, this is, if we use other diseases as the example, in the final stages of eradication, it's going to be critical to have genetic data to know where infections are coming from, what transmission networks. I think the question is genetic data also useful in a high burden setting? And there I think that's a matter of research and a matter of this interface between what question are you asking and how will that help you make a decision in deployment of resources.
Philip, if you could pass the microphone down.
So I had a question for the panel, and a lot of this was around, each of you in a different way brought up this question, which was around uncertainties around health-seeking behavior. And as we think about, it was great to see the themes of data, surveillance as an intervention woven throughout the entire session. When we think about now health-seeking behavior, I loved how Pedro pointed out that there were uncertainties in the numerator and uncertainties in the denominator. What are some of the things, each of you pointed out ways in which, what can we know based on what we have now, and what are the routes to improving this, and how far do we need to go on that? And was wondering if you could comment along those lines.
Yeah, I know that measuring health-seeking behavior may be one of the most difficult tasks that we have, but I do know that several people trying to find methods of accurately estimate how do people behave regarding the health status. Normally, we measure that by asking the people during the surveys if they had fever, and if when they got fever, what they do. This is the classic way of measuring it. But this is also linked to other problems on who we are asking that question, and if we are the population that, for instance, for reactive case detection and response, we mentioned that most of the people that we normally don't find for instance, young men or men that are working outside the place we are acting. And for this specific group, for instance, it's hard to know how do they behave in terms of when they got fever or not. So this is what I think.
I think to try to add to what you said rather than repeat what you said, which I completely agree with, I think there's a big need to understand symptomaticity in the first place, and whether the question, did you have fever in the last 2 weeks, is the right question always. Of course, in modeling, it's really important to understand just what is going on in the first place and what might trigger health seeking in the model. But I think fundamentally that's kind of a basic biology and epidemiology question that we don't quite understand yet.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that, and I don't think it's an easy nut to crack at all. I think there's opportunities to make relatively rapid gains in our information that we have available. We could do more than just ask, have you had a fever in the last 2 weeks? And then a very limited set of questions as follow-up to that. Maybe not rolled out across all household surveys, but piloted in specific places. We could really drill down a lot more and then triangulate that back against the more widely applied survey questions. I think that, there's missed opportunities in cross-sectional surveys to get a little bit more information that would be helpful. We do need to be creative here, I think.
All right.
No, I agree with what everyone else has said so far. I also wanted to just comment on the fact that we tend to focus on a fever and whether it's been treated or not, but we ignore the decision to actually seek treatment. And measuring that isn't necessarily the strength of quantitative epidemiologists. It's something that is probably done best in the social sciences by anthropologists and others. And bringing the various disciplines to understand what makes a person make a specific decision as to whether to seek treatment or not is key. One of the things we ignore from the household surveys, and we can't define actually in the household surveys, is delayed decision making. What proportion of people who have not sought treatment today are going to seek treatment in the coming days? And that might be a big proportion of the so-called not seeking treatment.
Question?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask a question, particularly about the modeling work and training it to respond to different kinds of interventions. I was thinking, even in the context of Zambia, that in Lusaka, where there's been so much development and infrastructure and drainage and areas that used to have malaria that don't because there's a mall there now, I'm wondering if there would be a way to model other kinds of multi-sectoral interventions and the effect that those pieces may have, whether it's rural electrification projects, whether it's proper drainage and construction and agriculture, et cetera, just to, I guess, ask what you thought the potential of coming up with training models to respond to multi-sectoral interventions, and to get your response. Thank you.
Wow, I would love to just tell my model, add hydroelectric dam and see what happens. But what you're referring to here is, what is the impact on development and projects like this on say, like the availability of habitat for the vector, because that's what's changing, right? When you're paving systems, you're like, anopheles can no longer live there. So the challenge for the question like that is that I would need some information about just what is going on. Are you paving over 100% of the breeding sites within what square kilometer region? How fast is that going? Does that have implications for what different vector species might now find the place more habitable? So, the model, I can do anything, but I don't want to do anything. I want to do something that's actually realistic. So it's a challenge for people who gather data to be able to tell me what are you seeing in the field?
Well, I have a very simple question, because we pulled together this group because we got to wondering about what the state of the malaria world was and how to understand it. And as we were talking about how to understand it, you first got to start by what you're measuring, and then how you take that information. I'm very simple. How you take that information and interpret it. And each of you have spoken about it in slightly different ways. So I'd like you to take a step back and say, based on the kind of data that you're talking about, whether you're visualizing it, measuring it, modeling it, are things getting better or are things getting worse? Dr. Noor, you will be last. I'm not really asking for a peek into the World Malaria Report 2018, but I'm saying based on what you're seeing and the analysis that you're each doing, and maybe Pete, you just did a whole lot of mapping,
yeah,
and you just finished this 2018 report. Where do you think we're going?
I think broadly the storyline that's emerged in the last year or two is the right one. It's that, we have seen rapid progress, and now we're not seeing rapid progress. Now, whether we're flatlining, whether we're going down slightly more slowly, whether we're getting slightly up, we maybe don't really have the precision to differentiate those scenarios, but it almost doesn't matter. We're slowing down. Okay, in the key places. We're not slowing down everywhere by any means. There's many storylines happening around the world, many of which are heading exactly where we want them to head. In the heartland of high endemic Africa, at the moment, the story seems to be one of deceleration of progress. I would probably stop there in terms of my assessment.
Okay. Jolene, you've got large data sets, many more than what you were able to tell in such a brief story. How are we doing?
I actually just feel really hopeful. I think we know more now about malaria than we ever did. And it's better to know that we've stalled than to not know we've stalled. And we know more about the stalling than we could have known 5 years ago. We have new models, we have more data. We're very much energized to doing something about it. So ultimately, I think I feel really positive about what we can do, even though the problem is clearly a really serious one.
Pedro Ide, you're working in southern Mozambique. Mozambique is one of the top 10 countries, but you're working in a very special area and have put in a set of interventions. How do you think things are going?
For me, I think it's both simple and complex, and it depends on the level of expertise of the person who sees or reads the data. For Mozambique, for instance, if we are talking about all this high-tech data has been presented here, if we see that this is posed to a program officer in a district like Magudi who doesn't understand a lot of it, it will be complicated, and he can ignore completely, even if the data is well informative. But if that is translated into a very simple way of explaining what that means and accompanied by a set of responses that could be chosen to act against that data, I think it could be easy. So for me, as much simple the ways of showing the data is, it will be well accepted and used.
Okay, thank you. Diane, you do not have all the data points you would like. You would love to collect more data points, but based on the areas that you're working on, how are we doing?
I would say I agree with the comment that we now know much better where we stand. Mm-hmm. I would say that previously, I think the solidness of the data prior to the last 4 or 5 years is probably in question. Not to say it's completely inaccurate, but now I think we are starting to figure out what we know and what we don't know. And I'm very hopeful that we made progress. There's no question. I think that there is a challenge. I think we have kind of reached a point where we've applied with as much, sort of intensity as is possible under current conditions, the tools that we have. And so I think we're ready for a pivot. We're ready for a change in how we look at things, and we have much more data and much more integration of data and much more realization what the data is telling us.
Dr. Noor, final word.
I'm as hopeful as everyone else. And I think there's no question we are in a much better place than we were in 2000 or around 2000. But it's about making progress. And the data suggests that over the last 3-4 years that progress has stalled. And now it's about how do we, as Diane says, pivot again towards further progress. I think that's the discussion here. There's no question that we're in a significantly better place than we were before. The only thing that sometimes I find a little bit regrettable is we haven't really made use of the data and the tools available to us that we could have used 2-3 years ago to ensure that we do not revert in some settings, to be more efficient with the way we do things and more alert and really accelerate towards further gains. And I think the response should be around how best do we use those tools.
We have one last question.
Hi, I'm Bugvi Rao from Médecins Sans Frontières. The words that I hadn't heard anyone say at the moment are refugees, conflict, and people in flight. And we know, even from the last World Malaria Report, that levels of, that malaria is resurgent in many conflict areas, and that we're seeing it in Yemen and Rwanda and places that we thought had really reduced. How are your incredible sort of tools and capabilities that you've been talking about so far, how are they going to capture what is happening in Eastern DRC or South Sudan? And are these numbers therefore being massively underestimated in these reports, and therefore are these hotspots being forgotten?
Perhaps that's Dr. Noor.
Yeah, that's a very good question. We, as the Global Malaria Program, have been closely working with other departments in WHO that are responsible for emergency response to look at the burden of malaria among refugees. In a paradoxical way, the information about malaria in refugees is probably more solid than the information about malaria in the wider population. And in some settings, the response more appropriate than it is in the wider population settings, notwithstanding the tragedy of conflict. And I do not mean to say that this is happening everywhere. But more broadly, conflict has played a significant role, I would say, in countries like the DRC, in South Sudan, in Yemen more recently, to reverse all the gains that have been made over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And that really is, among the many other tragedies, the real malaria tragedy.
To finish off this session, I would like to invite Abhilasha Karki up to the podium. I'm assuming she's here. She was shy, she was standing in the back. As you know, if you went to the session last night, Abhilasha is our new Alan J. McGill Fellow. And in recognition of that, Philip has the new ASTMH Alan J. McGill medal to give her.
On this medal it says, honoring the legacy of Alan J. McGill, leadership, commitment, inspiration, and excellence. Congratulations.